Before Europe learned to cut bone, a surgeon in the Nile Valley had already mapped the human skull and described techniques that read like modern field surgery. Before universities in Oxford or Paris, sand-swept libraries in Timbuktu stored hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, laws, astronomy, medicine, that scholars traveled across the Sahara to read. Before the West's Iron Age, blacksmiths in West Africa were melting ore in furnaces so hot and precise they cast faces and kings in bronze that still take the breath away. Tonight, we will do something simple and dangerous. We will pull the curtain off the history they thought they owned. 7 inventions. 7 lightning strikes of brilliance from Africa that changed the course of the world and were too often misnamed, ignored, or stolen. I promise you a single rule for the next few minutes. When you think you know the origin, I'll make you doubt it. Keep your eyes on the screen, because the opening fact will not just surprise you. It will make the rest of the story make sense. Innovation begins where need meets craft. The river valleys of Africa were laboratories of metallurgy, of medicine, of mathematics. The earliest written medical texts we possess come from the Nile methodical, clinical, and practical. Those records show knowledge of injuries, infections, and surgical procedures long before similar texts appear in Europe. This is not myth. It is a paper trail, a surgeon's manual written in hieratic hand. But invention is stubborn. It moves across desert paths and trading networks. The same continent that produced precise surgical treatises also produced iron smelters in sub-Saharan villages, bronze founders in riverine cities, and astronomers who read the hidden language of the stars. Over the next chapters, we will trace 7 inventions and a repeating pattern. Invention, mastery, memory, then erasure. Imagine a field hospital 4,000 years ago, linen fluttering, wine and honey within reach, a copper scalpel glinting in the desert light. The Edwin Smith Papyrus reads like a field manual, wound by wound, diagnosis, treatment, and outcome. It describes the position of the skull, the pulse, the swelling of tissue, and prescribes suturing, splinting, and cauterization centuries before the Greek word surgery even existed. Each line feels shockingly modern. If you treat this man with knife and fire, you will save him. Even prosthetics, a crafted wooden toe from Thebes, smoothed by use, showing a physician's empathy and a patient who lived long enough to walk again. These are not relics of luck. They are the footnotes of a functioning medical tradition, one that combined observation with discipline. For centuries, Europe would grope through superstition before it reached this level of clinical reason. So keep that image. A surgeon by the Nile, mapping the skull of a fallen worker, drawing lines of understanding that should have echoed louder through history. Building at scale forces math to become practical. The stones demand precision, not myth, but measurable truth. The monumental architecture of Egypt and Nubia is not the product of intuition alone. It is engineering born from calculation, alignment, and design. Beneath every towering obelisk and temple axis was geometry ratios, right angles, and shadows tracked by the sun. The same systems that squared foundations and set perfect corners also gave rise to proportion, land surveying, and the mathematics of time itself. These builders were not just artisans, they were the first engineers, translating vision into stone and sky. Their measurements fed the Nile's flood calendars, their angles shaped architecture from the Sahara to the Aegean. This is not about claiming origin, it's about tracing a current, a chain of transmission that begins here and ripples outward, unseen but undeniable. We often assume that alphabets were imported, that writing began somewhere across the sea and trickled south. But powerful writing systems were born inside Africa too, deliberate, structured, and alive with meaning. The Meroitic script of Kush and the regional symbol systems that surrounded it carried law, ritual, and administration for centuries. Each glyph was both a record and a revelation, proof that literacy here was not a luxury, but an engine for governance, for science, for memory. When the scribes of Meroë pressed ink to papyrus or carved words into stone, they were not just recording speech. They were crystallizing civilization. The capital at Meroë became a pulse of intellect. Archives, schools, and royal offices alive with the rhythm of written thought, transmitting technical knowledge across the Sahel. The lesson is simple and eternal. When you record, you preserve. When you preserve, you build a foundation that shapes the future. From the red earth at Nok to the glowing furnaces of Benin, Africa's smiths shaped destiny from dust. They took raw ore buried in the belly of the land and transformed it into plows, blades, and beauty. The Nok culture's ironworking stands among humanity's earliest evidence of sub-Saharan metallurgy, a technology that revolutionized how people farmed, fought, and forged identity. Then came Benin, master casters who spoke in bronze. Their furnaces roared like thunder. Their molds carried memory. Through the lost wax technique, they created not just portraits of kings, but living archives history sculpted in metal, immune to fire and time. Every bronze was a record of coronations, of wars, of ancestors surviving where parchment could not. But these masterpieces did not always stay home. Many were looted, paraded through foreign courts as curiosities, stripped of their origin and genius. In Europe, they were called primitive trophies. But in truth, they were coded blueprints, the proof of a civilization that understood chemistry, temperature control, and artistic anatomy centuries ahead of its supposed time. Comparative beat. Across the world, the timelines of metallurgy were not one-directional. Africa's steel and iron industries often developed in parallel or earlier than Europe's. The evidence is inconvenient for the colonial story of progress because it tells a different truth: that brilliance was never imported. It was indigenous. Across the continent, people read the sky. Ancient Egyptian astronomy produced a solar calendar, a practical seasonal system that guided agriculture and ritual. Farther west, the Dogon's oral records and cosmological systems contain knowledge linked to star cycles that European visitors found baffling. The Dogon material has been the subject of controversy and debate, but the core point stands. African communities practiced precise astronomy and timekeeping long before these skills were repackaged in other continents. Visual beat. Picture caravans crossing dunes with star maps stored as memory navigators who used sky lore as GPS. Knowledge of the heavens is practical, portable, and therefore revolutionary. In the sands of Timbuktu, learning was not a rumor, it was a system. Sankore and the manuscript culture of Mali preserved law, astronomy, medicine, and poetry, hundreds of thousands of pages accumulated across centuries. Students came from across Africa and beyond to study, copy, and debate texts. These libraries were not isolated curiosities. They were nodes of scholarship that connected West Africa to Mediterranean learning and supported a flourishing intellectual life. Comparative beat. Al-Qarawiyyin and Sankore existed as living, teaching institutions long before Europe's universities reached comparable scale. The notion of academic lineage, master to student, text to commentary, thrives in these places. What happened to this knowledge? The answer is not a single villain, but a process. Looting of objects, suppression of local education, and a rewriting of prestige in favor of imperial powers. Bronze plaques ended up in European museums. Manuscripts were scattered, hidden, or destroyed. Instruments were catalogued as curios. The result? A historical amnesia that justified the colonizers' rule. But the story reverses now. Repatriation movements, manuscript digitization projects, and scholarship from African universities are bringing the narrative back into balance. The same hands that forged bronze and mapped stars now work in labs, in archives, and online translating, publishing, and teaching. Beat, invention never dies. It waits for someone literate and proud enough to say, "This came from here." If history taught us to forget, then let this be the first correction. Share this chapter. Look for the manuscripts. Visit the Smiths if you can. Demand proper context for the bronzes in museums. Most of all, when you hear first in a history lecture, ask, "First where?" Because the true story of invention is always a map, and for far too long, large parts of that map have been hidden. This was 7 inventions. There are hundreds more. We have only started to dust them off,